Hi besties, I am with the Bashan Lashari with Corevanta. Today we should discuss about the
Blake Lively's secret scandal exposed was not just a headline but a cultural earthquake that rippled through every corridor of Hollywood, sending tremors through the carefully polished image she had cultivated for years. Because for more than a decade Blake had been held up as the golden girl, the flawless actress whose charm, grace, marriage to Ryan Reynolds, and friendships with figures like Taylor Swift were celebrated as a model of modern celebrity stability. Yet behind that shimmering curtain there were whispers, documents, testimonies, and betrayals that painted a picture so different, so dark, that when the truth finally broke loose, Hollywood could no longer stay silent. And what followed was a saga of secrecy, manipulation, courtroom tension, and shattered illusions that pulled in names far beyond Blake herself. From Ryan to Justin Baldoni, from high-powered lawyers like Brian Friedman to cultural powerhouses like Selena Gomez, all caught in the crossfire of a scandal that seemed tailor-made to expose the hypocrisy and fragility of the industry's brightest stars. For the story began with small murmurs, unconfirmed leaks that appeared on niche blogs, half-hidden Reddit posts, blind items on gossip columns suggesting that the perfect image of Blake Lively was being used as a mask to conceal ruthless decisions, backroom deals, and personal vendettas. And though her PR machine worked tirelessly to dismiss them as baseless speculation, those who paid attention noticed how aggressive her camp became at silencing even the faintest criticism, sending cease and desist letters, intimidating smaller outlets, leaning on her friendships with powerful journalists, and portraying Blake as untouchable. But as history shows, no secret stays buried forever. And the first crack appeared when an internal legal filing linked Blake indirectly to a dispute between Ryan Reynolds' production ventures and Justin Baldoni's team. And while the mainstream press initially ignored it,
shielded her from scrutiny, because while the public still clung to memories of her glamorous red carpet appearances and aspirational lifestyle branding, the court revealed a version of Blake that was far less palatable. One where calculated alliances, hushed agreements, and carefully timed leaks painted a portrait of someone who wasn't merely the victim of scandal, but perhaps an architect of manipulation herself. And as transcripts from depositions began leaking in fragments across gossip blogs and legal commentary channels, the details became juicier and more damning. Evasive answers about her involvement in certain projects, contradictions between her statements and what documents revealed, and perhaps most damaging, the insinuation that she had knowingly tried to lean on her Gossip Girl legacy to intimidate and distract from the actual legal questions at hand, as though the persona of Serena Woodsen could be conjured up in court as both shield and sword. And while casual, fans might scoff at the notion that a television role could echo so loudly in a federal hearing, the reality was that perception in Hollywood is currency, and Judge Lyman's sharp rebuke of her theatrics made clear that the bench wasn't buying into the glamorized image being projected, which is precisely why the headline "Judge Slams Blake Lively as Gossip Girl" spread like wildfire. It was short, sensational, and devastatingly effective in reframing the narrative from one of actress versus accuser to a cautionary tale about the collapse of celebrity myth-making under the cold scrutiny of the law. And if that weren't enough to ignite controversy, the timing of a leaked audio recording, allegedly capturing tense strategy discussions between Blake's camp and Justin Baldoni.
Involvement of Selena Gomez, who had long been connected to both Blake and Taylor. But when she discovered her own name caught up in documents suggesting conflicts of interest and covert attempts to leverage her brand for mutual protection, Selena reportedly confronted Blake in private, an encounter that later leaked through anonymous sources as explosive, emotional, and filled with accusations of betrayal. And when that story hit the tabloids, fans could no longer separate the personal from the professional, demanding accountability. And as more filings surfaced, the narrative grew darker, revealing emails, text exchanges, and insider testimonies that painted Blake not as the innocent bystander, but as a central strategist, a woman who weaponized her image of sweetness and stability as a shield while quietly pulling strings. And the irony that Hollywood itself, long complicit in building her pedestal, now found itself struggling to defend her was not lost on observers. For when journalists finally broke their silence, when Variety and Hollywood Reporter cautiously began running exposés, The dam burst. Talk shows speculated openly. Podcasts dissected every angle. Fans on TikTok and Twitter compiled timelines of her connections to suspicious deals, and the pressure became unbearable, with Blake forced to appear publicly, delivering emotional statements that critics described as rehearsed, deflecting, and carefully engineered, yet failing to stem the tide. Because the court of public opinion had already decided that her secrets, whatever their ultimate legal status, had destroyed her credibility, and as Hollywood insiders whispered that Ryan was consulting divorce lawyers, that Taylor was quietly distancing herself, that Justin was preparing for a massive countersuit, and that Friedman was poised to deliver his most devastating revelations yet. The scandal evolved from a single secret into a mirror of Hollywood itself, exposing how image, power, loyalty, and betrayal intertwine in ways the public rarely sees. And part one of this saga, the exposure itself, ended not with resolution but with more questions than answers, with fans worldwide hooked, demanding to know just how deep Blake's deception went, how complicit her allies had been, and whether Hollywood, now unable to stay silent, would finally hold one of its brightest stars accountable for the shadows she cast. Blake Lively's unraveling was no longer about whispers or half-hidden leaks, but a full-blown eruption that consumed Hollywood's every waking conversation, because once the initial veil had been ripped away, once the public had tasted the scandal, there was no putting it back in the shadows, and part two began with the courtroom, a place Blake had spent her entire career avoiding, because the polished actress had always crafted an aura of being above litigation, above controversy, yet now, compelled by filings that could no longer be suppressed, she found herself at the mercy of judges, lawyers, and public scrutiny that was far harsher than any red carpet flashbulb, and Ryan Reynolds, once her shield, was dragged into the proceedings, not as a loyal spouse smiling for the cameras, but as a man torn between two impossible roles. Because privately, he was livid that his reputation and business ventures had been entangled in what he described to friends as Blake's secret war, and while he appeared in court holding her hand, insiders revealed his frustration was volcanic, that he had threatened to leave their home more than once, that meetings with his legal advisors were less about protecting Blake and more about protecting himself from collateral damage, and this tension was exploited masterfully by Justin Baldoni, who entered the legal battlefield with a ferocity no one expected, because Baldoni had been underestimated for years, branded as a soft-spoken actor, director. But now, with his credibility on the line and Blake's alleged sabotage of his project surfacing through paper trails and testimonies, he became her most dangerous rival, aligning with Brian Friedman, the powerhouse lawyer who seemed almost gleeful in tearing apart the threads of Blake's carefully spun narrative, presenting documents that linked her to private emails, backroom calls, and intimidation tactics that shocked even seasoned journalists. And the more they revealed, the more Hollywood gasped, because this wasn't simply a tale of a celebrity caught in a messy feud, but a blueprint of how the industry allowed its darlings to quietly crush competition, how executives bowed to whispers from a starlet's team, how silence was bought. And in this way, Blake's scandal became larger than Blake herself. It became a mirror, and Hollywood hated mirrors, especially ones that showed its ugliest truths, and in the chaos, Taylor Swift, once Blake's closest friend, once the anchor that had given Blake legitimacy in the eyes of millions of Swifties, found herself under unbearable pressure because fans demanded answers, demanded to know why she, a champion of authenticity, remained quiet while Blake was accused of manipulation. And though Taylor tried to play neutral, focusing on her tour and projects, her silence screamed louder than any statement, and insiders confirmed she was pulling back, canceling joint appearances, quietly editing plans that involved Blake. And this distance was devastating for Blake, because losing Taylor's shield meant losing one of the most powerful fan armies in the world, and the Swifties turned fast, flooding Blake's posts with accusations, splicing together timelines, digging through interviews for inconsistencies, and creating viral threads that painted Blake as a master manipulator, a betrayal that cut deeper because it wasn't the tabloids or lawyers now. It was the fans, the very people Blake had relied on for her public image, And in parallel, Selena Gomez was being pulled into the storm because Selena's connection to both Taylor and Blake made her silence impossible. And when leaks suggested that Blake's camp had once attempted to pressure Selena into joint endorsements to deflect scrutiny, Selena was forced to respond, posting cryptic messages about loyalty, about betrayal, about choosing peace over politics, which fans instantly decoded as thinly veiled shots at Blake. And as her words spread, the narrative hardened. Blake was increasingly isolated, painted not as a victim of Hollywood politics, but as their mastermind, and Friedman capitalized on this shift, unleashing a new wave of filings that outlined alleged financial improprieties, undisclosed partnerships, and patterns of behavior that suggested deliberate deception. And the courtroom, once a quiet space of legalese, became a stage. Reporters packed into every hearing, sketch artists capturing Blake's tense expressions, her hand gripping Ryan's as whispers swirled that he was ready to bolt, and the headlines grew harsher. No longer questions surround Blake, but lively caught in web of lies. Ryan's breaking point. Hollywood turns against its darling. And these headlines weren't isolated. They dominated morning shows, podcasts, YouTube breakdowns with millions of views, TikToks dissecting every facial expression, and Hollywood insiders whispered that producers were distancing themselves, deals were quietly paused, brands reevaluated contracts, and Blake's empire was trembling. And through it all, she tried to project strength, stepping into court in carefully chosen outfits, issuing tearful statements about love and truth, but critics shredded them, noting inconsistencies, scripted tones, and when she tried to frame herself as a mother fighting for her children's future, detractors pounced, arguing she had weaponized family to shield herself, and the irony grew unbearable. The actress once celebrated as America's sweetheart was now seen as Hollywood's schemer, and part 2 of this saga was the escalation, the moment when the scandal became inescapable, when silence was no longer possible, when every player, Ryan, Taylor,
The moment the gavel hit the bench again, it became clear that this saga had reached a dangerous turning point, because what had started as a spectacle of celebrity defiance was now evolving into a courtroom crucible where reputations, careers, and carefully constructed public images were burning under the relentless heat of scrutiny. And Blake Lively, once admired for her polished grace and adored for the glittering veneer of Gossip Girl nostalgia, was no longer shielded by her star power as Judge Lyman's repeated refusals to entertain speculation exposed cracks in her legal strategy that even her most loyal fans could not ignore. For what looked like strength from afar was, in reality, a house of cards trembling against the drafts of truth. And the boldest move of all was yet to come, when Justin Baldoni's legal camp, led by Brian Friedman, stepped forward with a counteroffensive sharp enough to cut through the layers of PR illusions Blake's team had been spinning in headlines and Instagram posts, because while Blake's lawyers leaned on sentimentality, curated throwbacks, and symbolic distractions, Baldoni's camp leaned on structure, evidence, and the precision of facts, wielding them like scalpels to peel back every inconsistent claim, until the image of the victim Blake tried to paint looked more like a calculated performance staged to redirect the public eye from deeper fractures in her own narrative. Fractures that were now widening into chasms with every court filing that landed on the docket, and perhaps the most damaging revelation came when whispers grew louder about Blake's dual role on set, not just as actress but as an unofficial coordinator of the very intimate scenes she later testified made her uncomfortable. Because this wasn't a contradiction hidden in tabloids, it was embedded in testimony, production notes, and even accounts from crew members who had seen her take the wheel on choreography and framing, which meant the court no longer had to ask.
Blake Lively's secret scandal exposed. Hollywood can't stay silent had already become the phrase whispered in every corner of Hollywood by the time the third wave of revelation struck, and by now it was no longer just a story of glamour meeting disgrace, but a full-scale saga of manipulation, betrayal, legal entanglements, and the fragile ecosystem of fame collapsing under the pressure of too many secrets kept for too long. Because part 3 of this scandal was less about what Blake Lively did in the past, and more about how those past actions collided with the present, setting off chain reactions that could no longer be silenced by PR statements, glossy magazine covers, or carefully curated Instagram posts, as Hollywood insiders started acknowledging that the storm had outgrown everyone's control, and if part 1 was about discovery, and part 2 about escalation, then part 3 was the unavoidable reckoning. The collapse of the carefully constructed facade and the undeniable emergence of truth in a world that thrives on lies. And it all began when journalists who had been working in the shadows finally pieced together fragments of financial records, leaked court documents, private testimonies, and messages that not only implicated Blake, but also revealed the complicity of her inner circle, forcing figures like Ryan Reynolds, Taylor Swift, Justin Baldoni, and even Selena Gomez into the line of fire. Because each one of them had played a role, directly or indirectly, in shielding, denying, or exploiting the scandal for their own purposes, and the moment the investigative documentary trailer dropped, showing glimpses of courtroom exchanges, furious phone calls, paparazzi footage, and behind-the-scenes whispers, Hollywood's silence was officially shattered. The industry gasped, and what had once been a private narrative of tension and betrayal exploded into the mainstream as audiences, critics, fans, and legal analysts demanded explanations, clarity, and leaving Blake in a position where denial was no longer an option, because the more she tried to defend herself, the deeper the contradictions grew, and soon it became impossible to hide the truth that her rise to power had not been as clean, as innocent, or as golden as the media machine once presented. Justice.
One way in the spotlight and another under oath. A story that collapsed not under Justin Baldoni's charisma or Taylor Swift's silence, but under the weight of its own contradictions, leaving Blake exposed, not as the heroine of a scripted drama, but as a cautionary tale of what happens when speculation masquerades as truth in a courtroom that only bows to evidence. The smear campaign narrative surrounding Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni didn't appear out of nowhere. It grew like a wildfire from the moment production tensions bled into lawsuits and then spilled into the wider court of public opinion. And the most striking thing about this saga is how it never seems to end. How every time one wave of headlines settles, another conveniently rises, framing Baldoni as the aggressor and Blake as the embattled victim. Even when court transcripts paint a far murkier picture, because according to those closest to the litigation, Blake's strategy has been to keep the fight alive indefinitely, making sure Justin never gets to breathe without facing a new round of insinuations, subpoenas, and strategically timed leaks. And this became particularly obvious when whispers began circulating that she had sought to gather information from sourced intelligence, a firm previously used by Wayfair for investigative purposes. A move that, if true, would highlight the blurred lines between legal discovery and PR warfare, since her camp seemed far more focused on proving the existence of shadowy smear campaigns than on addressing the actual factual holes in her claims. And the question that caught legal commentators off guard was not about Baldoni at all, but about Brian Friedman's sudden decision to enlist Alexander Shapiro and Jonathan Bach, two high-level legal tacticians whose reputations were built not on ordinary litigation, but on surgical appeals, media-conscious strategy, and their ability to flip the momentum of a case even when the evidence seemed stacked against them. Because you don't bring in Shapiro and Bach unless you're thinking multiple moves ahead, unless you're planning for ripple effects across related cases. And the timing of their arrival was more telling than anything Blake's side had put forward, since Friedman didn't add them at the beginning of the case, when things were still relatively straightforward. He waited until.
And yet in the middle of this inferno, Blake attempted to fight back, deploying her legal team, her PR advisors, and her loyal defenders to reframe the scandal as a witch hunt driven by jealousy and media greed. But the problem was that too much evidence, too many voices, and too many inconsistencies now existed, and no matter how hard she tried, each statement contradicted the last. Each denial raised new questions, and by the time Section 2 reached its crescendo, it was clear that Blake Lively was no longer in control of her narrative. Hollywood, the press, and the audience were, and they had decided they would no longer stay silent.
For a day at most, but nostalgia posts go viral, they linger, they drown out harsher stories, and what might look to casual fans like harmless fun looks to seasoned media watchers like a PR weapon, distraction farming at its finest, with Blake using carefully timed bursts of feel-good content to bury coverage of her setbacks. And insiders insist this is a pattern, not a one-off. saying she has a stockpile of old Gossip Girl content ready to deploy whenever the courtroom deals her a blow, ensuring that instead of fans digesting headlines about speculation cannot support discovery, they're busy reliving Serena Woodsen's wardrobe and behind-the-scenes friendships, and when you map the pattern, it becomes undeniable. Denial in court, nostalgia on Instagram, headlines grim, brand glowing again. A loop so well executed it almost functions like crisis management autopilot. But the bigger question this raises is about her true strategy. Is she actually trying to beat Justin Baldoni in the courtroom with evidence and law? Or is she playing an entirely different game? One where the legal battle is secondary to controlling perception, turning him into the villain in the media regardless of what the filings say. Because if you can't win in front of a judge, you can still win in front of millions of fans by shaping the narrative, and this is precisely why Friedman's edition of Shapiro and Bach looms so large, because their expertise isn't just in legal argument, it's in recognizing how connected cases ripple, how rulings in one arena bleed into reputations in another, and their involvement in related battles like Jones v. The New York Times proves they know how to spot weak links and leverage them, which makes Blake's desperate plays look even weaker, since it appears Friedman anticipated this collapse before she did, waiting until she stretched too far into speculation before tightening his side with specialists capable of exploiting every overreach. And that foresight is lethal, because it means while she's scrambling to hold her story together, he's already playing 5 steps ahead, building a chessboard where every pawn she moves becomes her undoing. And all of this underscores the bigger theme here. Manipulation cannot survive under a judge's spotlight, because as much as she may try to distract us with nostalgia, as much as she may try to seed rumors of smear campaigns, the courtroom keeps dragging her back to the same brutal demand. Show us proof, not performance. And the more she fails to meet that bar, the more her carefully crafted public image starts to unravel, leaving us with the haunting realization that what we're watching isn't just a lawsuit, it's the slow, painful disintegration of a narrative built on speculation, timing, and distraction rather than the hard backbone of truth. Blake Lively's carefully polished image of a beloved Hollywood star has in recent months begun to show cracks, and nowhere has that unraveling been more obvious than in the unfolding courtroom drama with Justin Baldoni. A conflict that has now drawn in not just lawyers and fans, but even seasoned observers of the entertainment industry, who recognize when strategy replaces substance, when public relations replaces proof, and when the lines between manipulation and desperation become impossible to miss. For the smear campaign that has been whispered about, analyzed in filings, and dissected across social media now reveals itself as less of a single episode and more of a pattern that stretches from the earliest hints of production conflicts to the headlines of today, each moment strung together by Blake's refusal to relinquish control of the narrative. And yet despite the surface-level strength of her team, her actions and missteps have illuminated not only the frailty of her case but also the surgical precision of Justin Baldoni's defense, particularly under the stewardship of his high-powered attorney Brian Friedman who, when the stakes reached their peak, strategically pulled in legal tacticians Alexander Shapiro and Jonathan Bach, names that might seem niche to the average reader, but in legal circles are synonymous with foresight, airtight argument, and the ability to transform cases teetering on collapse into stories of improbable survival, their late arrival into this saga signaling that Baldoni's side wasn't just reacting but planning several steps ahead, treating every one of Blake's speculative claims as fuel for a counterattack, every leak to the press as an opportunity to highlight her reliance on conjecture rather than hard fact, every nostalgic Gossip Girl post as a desperate attempt to distract her fans from the truth playing out under oath. And this unfolding battle reveals not only the fraught relationship between two public figures but also a deeper commentary on how celebrity warfare is no longer waged in closed rooms, but simultaneously across legal filings, entertainment outlets, Instagram feeds, and even the subtle timing of press cycles, leaving us to question whether Blake is fighting Justin in the courtroom at all, or whether she is really trying to fight us, the public, molding perception through distraction while the cold language of rulings undermines her credibility step by step. And to understand why this narrative is so potent, we must peel back the layers of her current demands, beginning with her reliance on sourced intelligence, the investigative firm connected to Wayfair, which she pointed to as evidence of an alleged smear campaign against her. A claim the court wasted little time dismissing as mere speculation. For despite her insistence that one of the agents linked to online commentary might have ties to sourced intelligence, she presented no facts to support such a link, no proof to anchor the suspicion in reality, and here lies the heart of her unraveling. Speculation cannot support discovery. Judges do not build rulings on maybes. And yet that is precisely what her legal campaign has been built upon. A tower of conjecture that collapses under even modest scrutiny. And while she floods her social media with gossip girl nostalgia, perfectly timed to coincide with legal losses, perfectly timed to drown out bad press, Friedman, Shapiro, and Bach move like chess masters, reinforcing Baldoni's defense, tightening the screws, and leaving Blake gasping for relevance. Her posts about Serena van der Woodsen's wardrobe doing little to shield her from the reality that judges are not swayed by nostalgia, and that every time she distracts her fans, she only underscores her reliance on PR over proof. An imbalance that Shapiro and Bach are uniquely skilled at dismantling, for they specialize in the overlap between cases, in ensuring rulings in one do not become vulnerabilities in another, and their presence signals Baldoni's team is preparing not just for this round, but for the inevitable appeals, for the domino effect rulings can have across related disputes like Jones versus AEL, or even the New York Times judgment, which touch on similar discovery battles and credibility questions. And it is this interconnectedness that makes Blake's strategy so brittle. For she is not playing a game of nostalgia and distraction against a single opponent, but against a network of precedents and rulings that refuse to bend to PR tactics. And in this dynamic we see how her narrative is collapsing, how every attempt to paint Baldoni as controlling or manipulative ricochets back onto her, leaving her scrambling to protect her image rather than her evidence, while Justin, once viewed as the underdog, stumbling through the swift connection, now finds himself buoyed by a defense so sharp that each of Blake's moves feels anticipated before it is even made, and the cycle repeats. Legal defeat, nostalgic post, distraction, dismissal. Until the pattern itself becomes evidence of manipulation, until even her fans begin to wonder whether the Gossip Girl throwbacks are less a celebration of the past than a smokescreen for the present, until her own reliance on performance becomes the clearest proof that she cannot win on substance. And thus part one of this scandal does not simply reveal a celebrity dispute but a cultural lesson, that in the collision between speculation and strategy, between nostalgia and legal precision, the truth is not always the narrative most loudly broadcast, but the one that survives the scrutiny of a judge unmoved by theatrics. And here Blake's carefully choreographed persona collides with the immovable demand for evidence, leaving us not with the golden girl of television, but with a case study in how manipulation cracks under pressure, how distraction dissolves under law, and how a courtroom is the one stage where performance alone is never enough. By the time the case reached its later stages, what had begun as a flashy spectacle of accusations and counterclaims had mutated into something much darker and far more revealing, because Blake Lively, once untouchable as Hollywood's darling, now stood in a spotlight that no carefully curated Instagram post could dim. As the court began dismantling not only her claims but her credibility, piece by piece, until the very foundations of her smear campaign collapsed under the weight of legal scrutiny, and the irony was painful to watch. The same actress who once played the glamorous Serena van der Woodsen on Gossip Girl, who thrived on secrets and manipulations, now found herself accused of orchestrating the very kind of manipulative narrative spin that her character had embodied. And while she clung to throwback posts and nostalgic PR stunts to control the headlines, the courtroom told a different story, one where Justin Baldoni's team, fortified by Brian Friedman, Alexander Shapiro and Jonathan Bach, played a relentless long game, exposing her reliance on speculation and timing their counterstrikes so cleanly that it felt less like a defense and more like an offensive war of attrition designed to choke out every thread of her argument, until nothing remained but the image of desperation. And what made this collapse so damning was not just the rejection of her requests for privileged discovery, or the judge's scathing reminder that mere speculation cannot support discovery, but the way the broader legal and public landscape responded, as each ruling against her began to strip away her ability to reframe the story, leaving her PR maneuvers increasingly transparent, increasingly hollow, increasingly easy to read as manipulation, so that when she unleashed Gossip Girl anniversary content right after a critical loss, the media no longer treated it as coincidence but as camouflage, as calculated distraction. And while the posts racked up likes, the undercurrent of skepticism grew louder, because fans may adore nostalgia but they are not blind to timing, and the shift was unmistakable. Blake was no longer controlling the narrative, she was reacting, and reaction is the clearest sign of weakness in both law and public image warfare. And here Justin Baldoni, once framed as the villain in her story, began to quietly reclaim the role of survivor, positioned not as the aggressor but as the man enduring a smear campaign amplified by celebrity machinery, and the optics shifted so dramatically that even Taylor Swift's quiet distance from Blake spoke volumes. For Swift, who had once stood as an unshakable ally, appeared increasingly careful not to tie herself too closely to a narrative unraveling so publicly. And in the world of celebrity politics, silence can be more deafening than words, and her silence in this saga suggested that even she understood that Blake's tactics were imploding, that to attach herself too closely would risk collateral damage. And so Baldoni's defense capitalized not only on legal precision, but also on the vacuum of support around Blake, a vacuum that no Gossip Girl throwback could fill. And by the time the judge issued the final blows, rejecting her discovery demands, noting the absence of factual support, and essentially labeling her claims as rooted in speculation rather than evidence, it was clear that the battle had shifted from whether Blake could win to how badly she would lose. And perhaps the most devastating part of this saga was not the rulings themselves but the way they stripped away the illusion of her control, because without the veneer of PR spin, what remained was a star who had built her attack on conjecture, who had attempted to weaponize nostalgia as a shield, and who ultimately underestimated the precision of an opponent willing to fight not for spectacle but for survival. And thus, when historians of celebrity scandals revisit this saga, they may not remember the fine details of Wayfair, First Intelligence, or the overlapping threads of Jones versus AEL, but they will remember the image of Blake Lively, Hollywood's golden girl, trying desperately to distract the public with photos of her younger self while a judge's ruling erased the credibility of her present self. And that image, the collapse of performance under the weight of fact, may be her true legacy in this scandal. For Justin Baldoni emerged battered but intact, his team proving that foresight, legal precision, and patience could dismantle even the most glittering PR machine, while Blake Lively's name, once a byword for glamour and control, became instead a cautionary tale of how speculation cannot win against evidence, how nostalgia cannot erase a courtroom record, and how even the most beloved stars can be exposed when the performance ends and the truth finally takes center stage. Thanks for watching. Subscribe my channel Corevanta for more updates, with Sardar Zuriat Abbas Khan Lashari.